Corfe Castle, 1,000 years of kings, queens, murder, law and civil war. Corfe Castle is one of those places where the ruins themselves can be slightly misleading. When we look at it today, we are looking at enormous pieces of broken masonry, towers leaning at impossible angles and walls that appear almost to have been thrown down the hillside. But Corfe Castle was not simply an old castle that gradually fell apart. Much of what we are looking at is the result of deliberate destruction. And before that destruction took place in 1646, Corfe had already stood at the centre of English history for hundreds of years. This was a royal stronghold before the Norman conquest. It became one of the early great stone castles of Norman England. It was fought over during the anarchy. King John spent enormous sums of money on it and used it both as a palace and a prison. It remained in royal hands for centuries before Elizabeth I sold it into private ownership. It then passed through the Hatton family to Lady Elizabeth Hatton, whose second husband happened to be one of the most important lawyers in English history, Sir Edward Coke. Finally, the castle came into the hands of the Banks family, and during the English Civil War, Lady Mary Banks defended it against Parliament until betrayal eventually brought the fortress down. So rather than looking at Corfe as one ruined building, it makes more sense to walk through it chronologically, because almost every generation added another layer to its story. Before the castle, Anglo-Saxon Corfe. Corfe's story begins before the castle itself. The name Corfe is generally connected with the Old English word ceorfan, meaning to cut or carve, referring to the natural gap cut through the Purbeck hills. That position explains immediately why this place mattered. Whoever controlled the gap controlled an important route through the surrounding landscape. Archaeological evidence shows that before the Norman castle existed, there was already a substantial Anglo-Saxon timber building here, probably occupied by people of extremely high status. And in 978, Corfe became associated with one of the great murder mysteries of Anglo-Saxon England. The teenage King Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr, came to Corfe to visit his younger half-brother Ethelred and his stepmother, Queen Elfthryth. Edward was killed. Later tradition accused Elfthryth of arranging the murder so that her own son could become king, although historians cannot prove that she was responsible. What is certain is that Edward died at Corfe in March 978, and Ethelred succeeded him, so Corfe was already associated with royal power, succession and murder almost 90 years before William the Conqueror arrived in England. 1066 and the Norman castle. Then came 1066. Following William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, castles appeared across England as the Normans established control over the country. Corfe's position made it exceptionally valuable. It stood close to the south coast and helped secure communications between England and Normandy. And this is where some of the masonry visible today becomes particularly interesting. The earliest surviving stone features belong to the late 11th century, during the period of William the Conqueror. Historic England identifies sections of the inner ward curtain wall and fragments of an early hall as the oldest visible parts of the Norman castle. And some of that early masonry uses the distinctive herringbone pattern. This is important because herringbone construction had a much older history. The Romans used a related technique known as opus spicatum, arranging bricks or stones diagonally in opposing directions to produce that familiar zigzag or fishbone appearance. The pattern continued to appear in medieval masonry long after Roman rule had ended, so seeing herringbone construction immediately gives us a connection with an extremely old building tradition. At Corfe, however, we have to be careful about what the masonry tells us. We cannot look at herringbone and declare that the wall itself is Roman. The National Trust describes Corfe's herringbone work as a distinctive Anglo-Saxon style and suggests that local masons may have been employed by the Norman builders. Historic England dates the earliest visible castle walls themselves to the late 11th century. And I find that particularly interesting because only recently I was looking at herringbone construction on an archaeological site where the technique appeared in Roman period archaeology. Here at Corfe, we can see the continuation of that basic structural idea centuries later. The people had changed, the kingdom had changed, England had been conquered, but building techniques could survive from one period into another. Henry I and the Great Keep Corfe became substantially grander under William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry I. The Great Keep was completed in about 1105. It stood around 21 metres high on top of a hill already approximately 55 metres above the surrounding landscape. Imagine seeing that in the early 12th century. The pale Purbeck limestone would have made the enormous tower visible from miles away. It was defensive, certainly, but it was also propaganda in stone. This building announced that a king lived here. Henry's Corfe was not simply a bleak military barracks either. It contained high-status royal accommodation designed to demonstrate wealth and authority. And Henry I also used Corfe for one of the other purposes that would become a recurring theme throughout its history: imprisonment. One particularly extraordinary prisoner connected with Corfe was Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy. Robert was Henry I's elder brother. After William the Conqueror died, his lands had effectively been divided between his sons. Robert inherited Normandy, while William Rufus became King of England. After William Rufus died, Henry seized the English throne. Eventually, Henry and Robert went to war. Henry defeated his brother at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, and Robert spent the remainder of his life imprisoned. Historic England records Corfe as one of the places where Robert was held. So already within a generation of the Norman conquest, Corfe was serving two functions that would define it for centuries. It was a magnificent royal residence, and it was somewhere you could put a politically inconvenient member of the royal family. 1139, Stephen, Matilda, and the Anarchy. When Henry I died in 1135, England entered another succession crisis. Henry had wanted his daughter Matilda to inherit his throne. Instead, his nephew Stephen became king. The resulting conflict became known as the Anarchy. Corfe sided with Matilda. In 1139, Stephen attempted to take the castle, and there is still physical evidence of that siege outside Corfe today. South of the castle are earthworks known as the Rings. They are believed to be the remains of siege works constructed by Stephen's forces as they attempted to capture Corfe. They failed. Corfe held out. Eventually, Stephen and Matilda's supporters reached a settlement under which Stephen remained king, but Matilda's son Henry would succeed him. When Stephen died in 1154, Matilda's son became Henry II, beginning the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry II and Richard the Lionheart. Interestingly, despite the enormous importance of both men elsewhere in English history, the reigns of Henry II and his son Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, were comparatively quiet periods at Corfe. Historic England describes them primarily as periods of repair rather than major reconstruction, but that was about to change dramatically because Richard's brother succeeded him, and his name was King John. King John, palace, prison and power. If there is one medieval king whose presence can still be felt particularly strongly at Corfe, it is John. John became king in 1199. He visited Corfe repeatedly and spent extraordinary amounts of money transforming the castle. The National Trust calculates that more than £1,400 was spent on improvements during John's reign, an enormous royal expenditure in medieval terms. Among the most important additions was the Gloriette. This was essentially a palace within the castle. There were royal chambers, private accommodation, and luxurious facilities, even including an indoor latrine for the king. So when we walk through these ruins today, we should not imagine King John simply living in a cold stone tower surrounded by soldiers. He was creating sophisticated royal accommodation, but the comfortable rooms existed beside something much darker. Corfe was also one of John's prisons, and that mattered because John's claim to the throne was not completely secure. His elder brother Geoffrey had died before becoming king, but Geoffrey had left a son, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur therefore represented a rival Plantagenet line and challenged John's right to rule. Arthur was captured by John's forces. Then, in 1203, he disappeared while in John's custody. Exactly what happened to Arthur remains uncertain, but he was never seen again. Arthur also had a sister, Eleanor of Brittany, and unlike Arthur, Eleanor survived. That also made her dangerous. John kept Eleanor under royal control, and Corfe was one of the castles associated with her imprisonment. After Arthur's disappearance, 25 of his knights were also imprisoned at Corfe. So Corfe under King John presents us with this remarkable contradiction. Upstairs there were royal chambers, expensive decoration, and the king's private accommodation. Elsewhere in the same fortress were prisoners whose family connections potentially threatened his crown. And then, in 1215, John's troubled reign produced Magna Carta. Magna Carta emerged from the confrontation between John and rebellious barons, who attempted to constrain the exercise of royal power. John accepted the charter at Runnymede, but the settlement quickly collapsed into civil war, and Corfe remained one of the great fortified symbols of royal authority. There is also something visible at Corfe today which belongs approximately to this period. The feature labelled Plunket Tower, historically also written Plukenet Tower, is not a reference to somebody called Alan Plunket. It is the name of part of the castle. The Royal Commission's survey dates one wall beside Plukenet Tower to the early 12th century and the adjacent Outer Bailey curtain to around 1215, so even within one small section of the ruins, you can physically see different centuries of the castle's development meeting one another. Henry III, a white castle on the hill. John died in 1216 and was succeeded by his young son Henry III. Henry also spent heavily at Corfe. In 1244 he ordered the keep to be whitewashed, just as work was being done at the Tower of London. Imagine what that must have looked like. Instead of the dark grey ruin we see today, an enormous pale or white royal tower would have dominated the skyline. Henry's Corfe remained militarily important as well. The castle was used for storing weapons and military supplies. In 1224, Corfe supplied 15,000 crossbow bolts for the royal siege of Bedford Castle. Edward I and the completion of the defences. Under Edward I, the outer defences continued to develop. Historic England records work during Edward's reign, completing parts of the Outer Bailey. By this stage, Corfe had evolved over approximately 200 years. What began as an early Norman stronghold had become a complicated fortress of wards, curtain walls, towers, gateways, royal chambers, and service buildings. Edward III repairing an aging fortress. By the 14th century, the castle was beginning to show its age. Under Edward III, a major survey was commissioned and extensive repairs followed between approximately 1356 and 1377. That is worth remembering when we look at medieval castles. They were not built once and simply left alone. They were constantly repaired, modernised, altered and adapted. Every king inherited what the previous generations had built and then had to decide whether to improve it, maintain it, or allow it to decline. Henry VII and Margaret Beaufort Corfe remained crown property through the upheavals of the later Middle Ages, including the Wars of the Roses. Then, in 1496, Henry VII had the castle prepared as a residence for his mother, Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby. Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary royal mother. She had been one of the central figures behind the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Her only child, Henry Tudor, defeated Richard III at Bosworth in 1485 and became Henry VII. So towards the end of the 15th century, this castle that had housed Norman kings and Plantagenet prisoners was being prepared for the woman who had helped establish the Tudors. Elizabeth I sells Corfe remained a royal property until the reign of Elizabeth I. And then, after approximately 5 centuries of royal control, something fundamental changed. In 1572, Elizabeth sold Corfe Castle to Sir Christopher Hatton. Hatton became one of Elizabeth's important courtiers and later Lord Chancellor. He also held the title Admiral of the Purbeck fleet, giving him authority connected with fitting out ships for defence and the capture of enemy vessels. Hatton also invested in voyages undertaken by Sir Francis Drake, and there is a wonderfully visible connection between Hatton and one of the most famous ships in English history. Hatton's family arms incorporated a golden hind. Drake's ship was renamed the Golden Hind in connection with his patron. So by the Elizabethan period, Corfe's history had moved beyond medieval royal struggles. It was now connected with the maritime world of Elizabethan England. William Hatton and Elizabeth Cecil Christopher Hatton never married. His property therefore passed eventually to his nephew William Newport, who adopted the Hatton surname and became William Hatton. William married a woman called Elizabeth Cecil. When William died in 1597, Elizabeth inherited his estates, including Corfe Castle. She became known as Lady Elizabeth Hatton, and Elizabeth seems to have looked at this medieval fortress in an entirely different way. She was not preparing Corfe to resist King Stephen. She was not imprisoning rival princes like John. Historical surveys suggest that she developed pleasure gardens within and around the castle. Think about that transformation. Areas created for medieval defence were becoming landscape spaces. A fortress was becoming something closer to a grand country residence. And then Elizabeth married again. Her second husband was Sir Edward Coke. And this is where anyone who has studied English law suddenly recognises a name, Sir Edward Coke. This really is the same Edward Coke who appears in legal history. Coke was born in 1552 and became one of the most influential jurists in English history. He served Elizabeth I as Attorney General. He later became Chief Justice of the Common Pleas and Chief Justice of King's Bench. His reports and institutes of the laws of England became foundational works in the study and development of English common law. So if you have studied law, there is an extremely good chance you have encountered Edward Coke. He does not quite belong to the Enlightenment itself. He died in 1634, before the period normally identified as the main Enlightenment. It is better to describe him as an early modern jurist whose work profoundly influenced later constitutional thinking. And his place in the Corfe story produces an extraordinary historical circle. Remember King John? John had massively expanded Corfe. John's confrontation with the barons produced Magna Carta. Centuries later, the husband of the woman who owned Corfe became one of the great legal champions of Magna Carta as a source of English constitutional liberty. Coke was also closely involved with the Petition of Right of 1628, through which Parliament challenged taxation without parliamentary consent, arbitrary imprisonment and other exercises of royal prerogative. So you have King John and Edward Coke connected to the same castle, but appearing on almost opposite sides of the constitutional story. One king became infamous for the arbitrary use of royal power. Several centuries later, Coke became famous for arguing that even government and monarchy were constrained by law. Elizabeth Hatton and Edward Coke's marriage, however, was anything but peaceful. They married in 1598 and their relationship deteriorated badly. They quarrelled over property and later became involved in a spectacular family dispute concerning the marriage of their daughter, Frances. Elizabeth was wealthy, independently connected, and apparently extremely unwilling to allow Coke simply to control everything she regarded as hers. So she deserves a place in this story independently of her famous husband. Corfe was her inherited property, and it was during her ownership that the pleasure gardens appeared. Eventually, Elizabeth sold Corfe, and the family who bought it would be its final private inhabitants. 1635, the Banks family arrived. In 1635, Sir John Banks purchased Corfe Castle and its estate. There is another legal connection here because Banks, like Coke, was a prominent lawyer. He served Charles I as Attorney General and later became Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. The following year, in 1636, he purchased the Kingston Lacy estate. The timing could hardly have been worse. Within 7 years, England was at war with itself, the English Civil War. In 1642, conflict erupted between King Charles I and Parliament. The Banks family supported the king. Sir John was frequently absent from Corfe because of his duties to Charles. That left his wife, Lady Mary Banks, and their family at the castle. By 1643, much of Dorset had fallen under parliamentary control. Corfe had not. And suddenly this old medieval fortress, much of which had been built centuries earlier, became militarily important again. Parliament wanted it. Mary Banks refused to surrender it. 1643. Brave Dame Mary. The first serious parliamentary attempt to seize Corfe came in 1643. There was initially an attempt to gain access by surprise. When that failed, the castle came under siege. Mary Banks helped organise its defence. Parliamentary forces vastly outnumbered the defenders, but Corfe's extraordinary position and its medieval fortifications made it exceedingly difficult to capture. For approximately 6 weeks, the castle resisted. Eventually, the parliamentary forces withdrew. Mary's defence of Corfe earned her the name Brave Dame Mary. Think about the irony of that. King John had spent a fortune strengthening Corfe more than 400 years earlier. The outer walls had been expanded in the 13th century. Generations of kings had repaired them, and now those medieval defences were still frustrating. An army fighting with weapons John could never have imagined. But the war continued. Sir John Banks died in December 1644. Mary was now a widow, and Corfe was still royalist. The second siege. By October 1645, Corfe was under siege again. This time Parliament was determined to finish the job. But once again, simply attacking the castle proved extraordinarily difficult. Corfe ultimately fell not because its walls were successfully battered into submission, but through betrayal and deception. A royalist officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pitman, betrayed the defenders. Parliamentary soldiers were allowed to enter disguised as royalist reinforcements. In February 1646, Corfe Castle finally fell, and Parliament now had a problem. They had discovered exactly how difficult this castle was to capture. They did not intend to fight for it again. March 1646, destroy Corfe Castle. In March 1646, Parliament ordered Corfe Castle to be demolished. Not abandoned, not converted, destroyed. Specialist military engineers known as sappers used explosives to break apart the fortifications. Walls were undermined, towers fractured, huge sections of masonry slipped, twisted, and collapsed. And that is why the ruins look the way they do today. When we see an enormous piece of wall leaning at an extraordinary angle, we are looking at the physical evidence of that deliberate slighting. Those walls did not simply lean slowly over 400 years because nobody repaired them. Some were deliberately destabilised. Parliament wanted to make certain that Corfe Castle could never again function as a fortress. The destruction itself has therefore become one of the most important archaeological layers of the site. Mary Banks gets her estates back. Destroying the castle did not end the Banks family's connection with Corfe. In 1647, Mary petitioned Parliament for the restoration of her estates. They were eventually returned following the payment of fines. But rebuilding Corfe would have been an enormous undertaking. The family chose another course. Sir John and Mary's son, Sir Ralph Banks, developed Kingston Lacy as the family's principal home. Corfe Castle remained in their possession, but the age of people actually living within its royal chambers was over, from fortress to romantic ruin. During the late 17th and 18th centuries, Corfe became a convenient source of building stone. Material was taken from the ruins and reused elsewhere, but attitudes towards ruined castles gradually changed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, ruins had become fashionable. People were fascinated by the picturesque and the romantic landscape. Suddenly, Corfe's broken towers were not simply the remains of an obsolete fortress. They were beautiful. Artists came to see them. Among those inspired by Corfe was J.M.W. Turner. The very destruction intended to erase Corfe's military importance had accidentally created the appearance for which the castle would eventually become famous. The Banks family keeps Corfe for more than 300 years. The Banks family continued to own both Corfe and Kingston Lacy for centuries. That connection finally ended with Henry John Ralph Banks, a descendant of Sir John Banks. He died in 1981. In accordance with his will, the Corfe Castle and Kingston Lacy estates passed to the National Trust in 1982. The bequest became one of the largest gifts in the history of the National Trust. Archaeology brings the castle back to life. Since the National Trust took responsibility for Corfe, archaeology has revealed more and more of the castle's history. Excavations have uncovered medieval pottery, floors, structures, and evidence of everyday life. One particularly unusual discovery was a 17th century Dutch-made smoke or stink bomb, an early form of grenade, recovered from the outer gatehouse. Excavations in another tower exposed an original floor buried beneath centuries of soil and rubble. And conservation work continues because preserving a deliberately shattered medieval fortress presents an extraordinary engineering challenge of its own. 1,000 years in one place. And that brings us back to the ruins standing here today. Once you understand the chronology, Corfe stops being simply a castle. It becomes a physical timeline. Before the Normans, an Anglo-Saxon royal site stood here. In 978, Edward the Martyr was killed at Corfe. After 1066, William the Conqueror established the Norman fortress. The late 11th century walls preserve some of the earliest masonry still visible today, including herringbone construction that reminds us of much older traditions of building. Around 1105, Henry I completed the enormous keep, and Corfe became both royal palace and royal prison. In 1139, King Stephen tried and failed to capture it during the anarchy. Then came the Plantagenets. King John transformed it into one of his great royal residences, created the Gloriette, imprisoned political rivals here, and spent enormous sums strengthening its defences. In 1215, while John's confrontation with his barons produced Magna Carta, those defences continued to expand. Henry III improved and whitewashed the castle. Edward I completed further outer defences. Edward III repaired the ageing fortress. Henry VII prepared it for his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Then, in 1572, Elizabeth I ended centuries of royal ownership by selling Corfe to Christopher Hatton. It passed to William Hatton and then to Lady Elizabeth Hatton, who turned parts of the medieval fortress into gardens. The castle of King John, the king associated forever with Magna Carta, eventually became the property of the woman married to Edward Coke, the lawyer who helped transform Magna Carta into one of the great authorities, invoked in arguments about the rights of the subject and limitations upon government. Then in 1635, Sir John Banks bought Corfe. Within a decade, his wife Mary was defending it for Charles I. She survived the first siege, the castle survived the guns, and ultimately Corfe was taken only after betrayal allowed parliamentary troops inside. Parliament then decided that this fortress was simply too dangerous to leave standing. In 1646 they blew it apart, and nearly 400 years later the evidence is still lying exactly in front of us. The leaning towers, the collapsed walls, the enormous slabs of masonry, the herringbone stonework, the royal chambers, the remains of the Gloriette. Every generation left something behind. That is what makes Corfe Castle so extraordinary. It isn't simply the story of one king, one family, or one war. It is the story of England itself compressed into one hilltop. Saxon kings, Norman conquerors, Plantagenet prisoners, Magna Carta, the Tudors, Elizabeth I, the beginnings of modern constitutional law, the Stuarts, civil war, and finally the Banks family, who kept the ruins for more than 300 years after their home had been deliberately destroyed. Parliament succeeded in making Corfe useless as a fortress, but in destroying it, they inadvertently preserved the moment of its defeat. The castle standing here today is therefore both a building and a battlefield, and when you walk through it, you are walking through nearly 1,000 years of English history written directly into the stone. You have been watching Abbe de Vere at the Royal Dragon Court, author, historian, genealogist and law graduate. I am also a member of the Council for British Archaeology, along with local archaeology groups. The information about Corfe Castle is about my family. These people make up the worldwide web of dragon family members Edward the Martyr, Ethelred the Unready, Queen Elfthryth, William the Conqueror, Henry I, Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, Empress Matilda, King Stephen, Henry II, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, King John, Arthur of Brittany, Eleanor of Brittany, Henry III, Edward I, Edward III, Henry VII, Margaret Beaufort, Elizabeth I, Sir Christopher Hatton, Sir Francis Drake, William Hatton, Lady Elizabeth Hatton, born Elizabeth Cecil, Sir Edward Coke, Charles I. You can find out more about how I am related to these people through following my journey here on YouTube, or pop over to my Facebook page. To investigate more about the dragon bloodlines, visit my website www.royaldragoncourt.com, where you can purchase our books by my father, Nicholas de Vere, The Secknail Kings, Transylvania to Tunbridge Wells, The Dragon Legacy, The Dragon Seed, and myself, Abbe de Vere, The Royal Dragon Court, Inbred Britain, The Forgotten Royals of the USA, and A Story of 1,000 Faces. History is fascinating when you remove conspiracy and spam, sensationalism, and stick to the facts. You may find that you are also related to these people, which makes your existence even more important. One missing person, one missing cell, and you may not have been you at all. Thank you for joining me on my road trip to Corfe Castle on the Isle of Purbeck.